Alastair, welcome back to Highlands.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being with us and thank you for doing dinner tonight.
Absolute pleasure.
Huge sold out event, so we are delighted. You have had an amazing career. You've been at the heart of politics, you're a prolific novelist, and you've now got this almost new chapter with, you know, an award-winning top of the podcast charts every week. One of the things we do at Inverness Chamber of Commerce is run developing the young workforce, which is about getting young people into a career, introducing them to employers, etc. What advice would you give young people? And if they wanted to get into journalism or politics, are the routes you followed, are they still open?
I talk in lots of schools, and I always say that if you'd have said to me when I was 15, 16, 17, 18, even into my 20s, that I would be a journalist, I wouldn't have thought of that back then, that I would work for a Prime Minister, that I'd go to over 100 countries, meet some of the people I've met. I'd have said, well, that's not going to happen. So the first thing I say is just don't rule out stuff. Don't cut your options down. But then I say, if you do know what you want to do, have the confidence to go and find the people that can help you open the doors to that. Now that might be formal routes through education, but I think we all know that sometimes it is about actually finding the person that knows the system that is going to mentor and sponsor you and help you to try to get through those doors. And you know, I do that with quite a lot of young people. You can't take on everybody that comes to you saying, can you give me a bit of a hand? But I think it's important that people who have been able to proceed through life in a successful way, that you understand that part of the responsibility then is to try and help other people, you know, try to do what they want to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And just sticking with young people, you've written so many books, but recently you've written books about politics for children. Mm-hmm. Why is that important, and was it easy, or was the discipline of getting into their language difficult?
Well, I'll tell you what happened. I wrote a book called But What Can I Do?, which was about, well, the subtitle said why politics has gone so wrong and what you can do to fix it. And that was aimed at an adult market, but particularly I think at people who felt they wanted to make change. And then it was another publisher who came and said, listen, this is great, but why don't you think about writing it specifically towards young people? So the two books that I've written, in fact, I've literally just finished the second one this morning. The first one's for primary schools and the second one for senior schools and young adults. Why do I think it's important? Because I actually think that we are terribly ill-informed in this country about politics. If you think that the day after the Brexit referendum, the most Googled question in Britain was, what is the European Union? When you think that the level of discourse inside politics, let alone the level of discourse about politics outside politics, I think sometimes is terrifyingly badly informed. So I think it's about trying to get across to young people that politics really matters, that it's interesting, that it can be fun, but above all, unless we all get engaged and involved in it, it's just going to carry on being what we've seen in recent years, which frankly at the UK level in particular has been a complete and total disaster.
Do you think it's better in other countries?
I think a lot depends on the personalities of the people who get to the top. I think we've really suffered by the fact that somebody as amoral as Johnson and somebody as utterly unsuited as Truss to become Prime Minister, I think it's done us a lot of damage. It'll take a while to undo it. But then you look at Trump in the United States, you look at Modi in India, who's turning the place into this kind of, you know, Hindu nationalist kind of mega personal empire almost. You look at Putin, but then I look at other people. I actually think Macron's been a good president of France, even though he's less popular than he was now. The fact that Donald Tusk has just won in Poland. You've got good people. There are good people in politics, but I think we've been through a really, really bad period, and I hope that a change of government, if there is a change of government when there's a general election, I hope that a change of government will really lead to huge change on the political front. But I think it's going to take more than a change of government. I think it's going to take everybody to understand, you know, we're in a bit of a mess and we've all got to think about how we get out of that.
Yeah, but a change of government won't necessarily get engagement levels up.
Will or won't?
Won't.
No, I think the engagement point, you see, I would do much more on the engagement point, and I don't think this will happen, but I'd like to see, well, I know you've got the lower voting age here, 16, I'd like to see that right across the country, even younger actually. Just, I'd like to see compulsory voting, I'd like to see proper political education in schools. Unless you do politics once you're over 16, you don't learn about politics in schools. So how do people learn about? How do people even understand what politics is, how it works? So we've got to have a change of culture about our politics.
Okay, so just turning to Scotland, you were at the heart of the government that delivered devolution. What do you think the successes and failures are, and do you think it's helped? Do you think it's satisfied the nationalist desire, or do you think it's fanned the flames?
Well, look, when we did the Scotland Act, which delivered on the promise of a Scottish Parliament, we deliberately had an electoral system that was designed so that one party never had total power. Why did we do that? Because at the time, we were so powerful, both in the UK with a massive 3-figure majority and in Scotland where we, ruled most of the councils and had most of the parliamentary seats, etc. So for the SNP then to have gone to become so all-powerful over a period of time was not exactly what was intended. However, I still think that, I think devolution has been a good thing. Ultimately, where I think we still have a problem, and we saw this recently in the English local and mayoral elections, I don't think we've done a good enough job at explaining and the public understanding, we're back to the point about education, the public understanding how the different layers of government relate to each other. The politicians don't help in a way because they'll always say, well, if it's going well, that's down to me, and if it's going badly, it's down to some other part of the political framework. But I think in general, I still think there should be more devolution, not less. I hope that if there's a change of government, that there's an understanding that, you look at the way I think the elected mayors have been useful and good and have been able to do good things in some areas. So I think on balance, I still think good thing to do. Did we intend for a long period in the SNP in power in Scotland? No, we didn't.
So would you ideally see that becoming even more local? Because the Scottish government's been quite centralising. Mm-hmm. Would you see more power to local areas like the Highlands? Yeah,
absolutely. I think that. So if you think about the phrase that we used to always talk about was subsidiarity. What can be local should be local, and what can't be local kind of goes up. And I think that's the best way to think of it. But ultimately, one of the reasons, where the Scottish parties have a point about the arrangements with Westminster is that they are dependent upon the UK government ultimately for overall funding in the main. That makes things difficult, particularly when we've been through the period of austerity after 2010 that has left local government around the country in a pretty poor state. And then you get to the point where we're back to the blame game. Well, whose fault is it that the local services aren't as good as they should be? Whose fault is it that mental health services aren't what they ought to be? That's I think where I wish we could get to a place where all layers of government, whatever their political views, understood that there's a shared objective in trying to deliver the services for which they're responsible. That's what I wish we had.
Yeah, and that the public understood.
And the public understood who was responsible for what.
Each way. Yeah. Because we see that all the time, councils getting blamed for central and vice versa. So turning even more specifically to Highlands, you obviously know the Highlands well. Your dad was born in Tyree. You're a massive friend of Charles Kennedy, so you understand this area a bit. But what's your perception of the Highlands today as a place to live and work? And what do you think the general perception inside Westminster is of the Highlands?
That's a very good question. I mean, my personal perception, and one of the reasons why I was more than happy to come here is because I just think it's one of the most beautiful places on earth. And I think sometimes people underestimate just how high it is up the kind of global ranking of most beautiful people on earth. And so that's, and then I think the other thing I'd say is that I have a sense that I think I do, particularly since my dad died probably, have a sense of belonging to a part of the culture that I like and appreciate. I think generally there's a very good question that. I remember, funny enough, I talked on the podcast this week, we had a question about whether the southwest of England was a neglected area. And I recalled a time when we were talking about structural funds, when we were a member of the European Union and the Germans were in the chair, and they were agreeing the structural funds, which was, you know, how the funding for regional development gets divvied up between all the regions of Europe. And Tony Blair having these really quite difficult arguments with Schroeder, who was then the German Chancellor. And Tony was absolutely batting for Devon and Cornwall and the Highlands and Islands because of specific needs and some of the challenges that are faced by, you know, having large areas of fairly unpopulated areas which nonetheless have needs of service and so forth. And I think the reason I was recalling that was because I think actually within the political firmament, I'm not sure that the Highlands and Islands are necessarily part of that UK national debate in a way that they should be. Now, is that because of devolution? I don't know. Sometimes it's about representation. It's about the people who represent an area. But I think I think there's probably a kind of a romantic view, but maybe that misunderstands or underestimates some of the specific challenges that are faced.
So in this week alone, we've had a £300 million investment from Sumitomo in a cable factory. We've had a $250 million American investment in a port. And if it all goes well, we should be providing the bulk of the UK's renewable energy in 20 years' time. Do you think there's an understanding of that?
No. And I think there should be, particularly on the last point.
Yeah.
Look, I could be wrong here, and this may be unfair to the sort of political conventional wisdoms as they're formed in Westminster. But I think if you were to talk about the north of Scotland in relation to energy, I suspect they're still focused on oil and gas as that part of the debate. So that issue about renewables as to whether it is fully understood. I should put on record, I hate using internal flights, but the only way I could get here on time was to fly. But I was really struck last night looking out of the plane, just how many in these amazing, beautiful areas, remote areas, just how many wind farms there were, which I think is a great thing. But are people aware that this region is such a big part of that? I don't think they are.
No, I don't think they are either. And it should now move to real offshore floating wind. It should move to hydrogen.
Yeah.
And we're the only part of the UK with the right geography, the deep water, the wind, and so on.
Yeah.
So we've a job to do.
Yeah, and I think these. No, I think because areas, every town, every city, every region has to have a sense of itself. And then you have to decide how much does it matter that sense of yourself is communicated more widely. And I think it's important. I think if you have a success story to tell about a particular sector in a particular region, then make sure that people know it, because that's how you build on that success.
Yeah, absolutely. Moving on to the podcast and the kind of central tenet of it, to be able to disagree agreeably. Is that something you've always had, or is that something you developed with experience and age? Do
you know what? I mean, Rory Stewart was shocked when I told him this. Disagree agreeably as a phrase and an idea came from John Bercow.
I think we're all shocked at that.
The former speaker. And it was, I met him at an Arsenal-Burnley game, and we were just chatting away. I know John quite well, and we were chatting away, and he said, you know, the trouble with politics, we've lost the art of disagreeing agreeably. And it came around just at the point when I was thinking about doing this podcast. So no, I think actually I've been I think in parts of my life, I've been quite a disagreeable disagreeer. And I still can be. I can still get very fired up by stuff. But I think one of the reasons for the success of the podcast is that we're two people, very different backgrounds, different politics on lots of different areas, but where we agree, we're happy to admit it, and where we disagree, we're happy to respect each other's opinion. And if you think about it, that's how most people live their lives.
Absolutely.
And I think what's happened is that the way that the media has developed and the way that social media has exacerbated that development, it's almost like over here you have a debate that says everybody's shouting at each other and calling each other liars and charlatans, which I do as well when I'm on social media. And then over here, this is how we talk about in real life. And then the media debate is kind of here. Well, we're trying to get back over there because I think that's where I think we have really suffered as a culture, as a political culture. I think we've really suffered because we've got the media that we've got. In the main, very, very biased. Yeah. Newspapers that really have the separation of news and comment is now just gone. Trivialization. Yeah. I've just been reading a report on the BBC about Keir Starmer's pledges that he launched yesterday, and it's the political editor of the BBC talking about the fact he wasn't wearing a tie and this backdrop and that, and he says at one point, "This may seem trivial and superficial." Yeah. And I think we do have a very trivial, superficial debate.
Yeah.
So let's try and
because of that, we sort of end up with the politicians we deserve, because that's the media we buy.
I think there's something in that, and I think it's a problem because, I mean, I try not to be negative about politics in the general. I can be negative about lots of specific things. Not that I think this has been the worst government we've ever had the last decade or so. But I think it's important not to do the thing of saying they're all terrible, they're all the same as each other, nothing ever changes, all that, they're all corrupt, all the bad stuff that gets said. I think if we ventilate those messages the whole time, one, we denigrate people who are actually quite good people, and there are lots of good people in politics, and secondly, we put off good people from thinking it's a world they would ever consider for themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Who's been the person that you had to find a way of being agreeable with that was hardest?
Do you mean in my life or in
your political life?
I don't think I've ever found it hard to be. I mean, if I've disagreed with somebody, I've never found it difficult to say so.
Okay.
I think the harder thing is when. I think the harder thing sometimes is when actually you agree with somebody, but you're probably thinking people think you shouldn't. So, you're like, it's that thing about when, let's just say, those rare occasions where the Tories say or do something that actually is really quite a good idea. It's sometimes hard to say, well, that's a good idea. No, I think I've always been pretty good at knowing the limits. And I've always found it, even back from the days when I was a journalist, and I was working on the Daily Mirror, very pro-Labour, very anti-Tory, Thatcher in power. I still managed to get on with people who were in her cabinet, and I think it's always about this thing, but I've always had a respect for people who are at least going to give it a go. And added to which, back then, I think there were some very, very, very clever people in her government.
Yeah, and it felt like back then the intentions were genuine, whether you agreed with them or not.
Yeah, I think you got the sense they were in it for the right reasons. Yeah. I'm not sure you get that sense.
I'm not sure you get that today, do we?
No.
So reaching out across the political divide, probably now most famous was Rory Stewart, but before that, absolutely with Charles Kennedy. Mm-hmm. What's Charles's legacy been? What's your fondest memories?
Oh, one of my fondest memories of Charles was when we were sitting looking at Ben Nevis, and I said, "God, it's beautiful, isn't it?" Yeah. He said, "Yeah." I said, "How many times have you been up there?" He said, "I've never been up there." I said, "What?" He said, "I don't even go to the bottom." He said, "There's no constituents up there." So, no, I've got a lot of. I mean, my memories of Charles are a mixture of very, very happy and very, very sad. I do think that if Charles had managed to get on top of his drinking and the issues that led to his drinking, I think he'd still be here, and I think he'd be amazing right now. Yeah. I think he's exactly the sort of politician you need right now. But in the end, he didn't, and it killed him, and that's very, very, very sad. Legacy is legacy is an interesting thing, isn't it? I think that, look, people certainly remember Charles much, much more than most politicians. I think he was. You talk about disagreeing agreeably. Charles was a very, very interesting example. So Charles was one of the few who was consistently against the Iraq War and spoke out very, very, very strongly against it. Unlike the Conservatives who now like to criticise us over the Iraq War, who were actually pushing us to go faster and harder. And Charles was somebody who was able to hold those views and to be very, very passionate about them, but then at least try to understand and respect people who took the opposite view. So even though he and I disagreed about that a lot, I don't think it ever came between a friendship. And I think that's quite important.
That's really important. That's what we do in the pub with our friends.
Exactly.
Yes. That's what life is. You've been very open about your depression, about other issues. Where you did that at a time when no one was talking about it. What gave you the courage to be so open?
Well, I don't see it as courage. You see, I think if you say courage, that almost reinforces the stigma.
No, fair enough.
The idea that it's somehow brave to talk about depression or anxiety or psychosis or whatever it might be. I don't feel it was brave at all. I think it was luck and chance in a way, because what happened to me, I knew a bit about mental illness anyway because my brother had schizophrenia. I had a breakdown myself, and at the time I was a young high-flying journalist, very well known in Fleet Street. Lots of stories went round about what happened. And I just decided, do you know what, I'll just tell everybody what happened. I'll just be completely open about it. I've never, ever, ever regretted that. And I think that's what gave me, not the courage, but gave me the insight that, do you know what, I don't understand why people don't want to talk about this. Because I'm finding that people are interested, very sympathetic, very supportive. For example, I went back to the Daily Mirror after my breakdown and after I'd been in hospital and stuff, and I went back to the Mirror, very drinking culture, where I'd been a very, very heavy drinker. And I told people what had happened, and I said, look, I've basically got to kick the booze. And only once did somebody actually try and encourage me to go and have a drink. So people were incredibly supportive and sympathetic. And then since then, I find that, in fact, as you know, I was in Sheffield yesterday at this suicide prevention conference, and I said, I think we've massively moved the dial on awareness, but we're going backwards on services. So we've got to keep going with it, because ultimately it's about the services, not just about the attitudes. And I sometimes worry that there are parts of government who think, oh, well, it's all about the attitudes. As long as we're changing the attitudes, it's not. It's about the services. And in a funny sort of way, well, not funny, but the improvement in attitudes has led to more and more people thinking, maybe I need help.
Yeah.
And then they find it's not. And then they find it's not there. And the other thing is, I like talking about mental health. I like campaigning on it. I feel better for it.
So leads on perfectly to a question we get asked by a lot of business leaders now, which is how can they better support their staff when their staff are going through periods of poor mental health? What would your advice to a business leader in that position be?
I would say to think about it less about what can we do when they're struggling, but what kind of environment can we create so they're less likely to be struggling. Now what I wouldn't ever do is say that somebody's mental health and well-being is all down to an employer. That's completely ridiculous, because it's about their own lives, families, history, all the stuff that we all know about, and most people have had something in their lives that it's not down to the employer. But what I think an employer can do is create an environment. One specific thing I would say to any employer, large or small, is invest in mental health first aid. Actually have a network of people who do mental health first aid. It's really interesting. It's helpful. both for the person doing the mental health first aid, learning about it, but also then hopefully for their ability to help others. I think leadership's incredibly important. I don't believe that leaders should sort of, come in every day and tell everybody how they're feeling, but I think leaders who have had struggles, that if they can be open about it, I think that will help create the culture that I'm talking about. I did an event with the Bank of Ireland just after the second lockdown, and the CEO, it was an all-staff online meeting, and the CEO said that as a result of what we've learned during COVID, the strategic priority of the bank has changed. It is now the mental health and well-being of our staff, because we've realised that we cannot do the other things unless we work on that. Now that was leadership. That was somebody saying, now, and then I said to the staff on the call, I said, listen, you've just heard it from the chief executive, you've now got to hold them to that. Yeah. So it's that sense of looking out for each other. And I think also the other thing is to have the understanding that from the employer's perspective, if we have a happier, healthy workforce, we're going to be a better company. We're going to be a better organisation. And the best ones do that, I think. The best ones are doing it already.
Okay, and final question. You're a huge fan of wild swimming. What's your favourite spot?
In the world?
In the world.
My favourite swimming spot has got to be Loch Fyne.
Now, I know why you're saying that, but no one else does.
Where I was swimming with your wife this morning. What's my favourite? Oh, God. Do you know what? It's not. Look, if you said to me what is my kind of swimming happy place,
okay, tell me that.
It's my local Lido in North London, because we go there pretty much every day when we're in London. But if I think about some of the best swims I've ever had, a lot of them have been in Scotland, a lot of them have been in the Highlands, but Fiona and I were in Lake Annecy.
It's beautiful. Last
year, and we swam, and it's the first place I've ever swum in. I mean, I should say that I did get hypothermia, but we'll park that. But the point about it was that you could, oh no, sorry, that was Lake Geneva.
Yeah.
Hypothermia was Lake Geneva. Lake Annecy was mesmerising how clean it was. You could swim out for quite a while and still see the bottom of the lake. Absolutely incredible.
We were there last year. Is it not too warm for you though? I felt it was.
Well, we were there in winter.
Right.
Yeah. No, that's the thing. I do like the cold water. I do like it to be cold. Loch Fyne this morning was
not cold enough.
It wasn't cold enough.
Yeah, sorry about that. Alastair, thank you so much.
Thank you. Absolute pleasure. Thank you.